All right. All right. We are on the path to the grim road. I think maybe uh if we aren't sure, we can stop and ask for directions. So we have five spoilers to go through today, all of which are sort of like interesting little minor tech cards, just little bits of spoilers that have been thrown out by Scarletch. I think he's got like a list of them that have been sort of tossed out for a bit, or they could have shown up in the Discord from other people. I don't think I've actually followed the exact spoilers, I just saw them as they showed up in the Reddit. But we have five new ones, and they're all pretty interesting. There's some pretty cool things going on here. We don't have any new mechanics yet. We know that Bond and Nightfall are both going to be announced at some point, but we aren't really sure what those two things are going to be. Bond will very likely be some sort of unit-focused thing, but it's possible that you could bond with spells or bond yourself to something. I'm curious to see what Bond does, especially since we already have one tribal mechanic. So if we see some other sort of unit-focused mechanic, that'll be cool. But I'm also curious to see like what mechanics are coming back, whether or not we're going to see some of the unique ones like Warcry and other things, or if we're going to see like which of the skills are going to be evergreen. We certainly are going to see some of those coming back, obviously Overwhelm and Flying and all of the stuff that you generally have on units. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see exactly all of the cool things that are happening. But let's talk about the individual cards. First off, we have Ask for Directions, a 2-cost card that reads Scout. For those of you who have forgotten, Scout is look at the top 2 cards of your deck, and then, or sorry, look at the top card of your deck, and then you can put it on the bottom. And that is basically all you get to do. You basically just get to decide if you're going to draw your next card, which is fairly useful, is often the equivalent to a card draw, is sort of, you can mechanically evaluate it as half of a card draw because you only use it about half the time, but it is often more useful than that because it essentially just means that every draw that you draw is the draw that you want. So in that extent, when you're considering it from that perspective, it is as valuable as a card draw until the point where you run out of cards. So basically, when you're drawing cards, you're looking for the ability to increase your options, to basically make sure that your deck is doing the plan that it wants to do as smoothly as possible. And you're looking for card advantage, which is where you are trying specifically to outlast your opponent on cards. And aggro decks care very much about the former, whereas just straight control decks care very much about the latter as well as the former. So Scout is more useful for control decks, but it actually has some place in aggro decks. And that's what we want to consider when we're looking at Ask for Directions, I think. Because what Ask for Directions offers you is that whenever you attack with 2 or more Explorers, you get to draw it from the void and then cast it again, which essentially means that it is a cantripping draw spell. It's a little bit expensive. 2 cost for a Scout is a little bit of an investment, but the result of it is that if you are playing an Explorer aggro deck, which I would have absolutely no doubt is an archetype in the Grim Road, then you have a really interesting way to make sure that your explorers are doing better and doing a job that is more reliable than another aggro deck. So if you're going to be focused on time, primal, and fire explorers, which there are explorers in all of those colors, then Scout is something that could potentially get you a decent amount of things going on. So yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. Is Fevered Scout an Explorer? I'd actually have to ask that question. I'm not sure. I think it's a mage. We can check real quick. Someone is asking. It's a soldier. Who knew? All right. So yeah, it's possible that Fevered Scout could be an Explorer, but that might be a thing that would be a requested change. So yeah, we have a lot of interesting explorers, including Bold Adventurer. The ones that I really like tend to run into the mid-range, which is where this card can really start to shine. We have Champion of Wisdom, we have Curiox, both of them. We have cards like Torgov, Icecap Trader, who is a really, really reliable sort of blue card. And then you have your standard, like, you know, middle-of-the-road ones like Sauropod Wrangler and Bold Adventurer. And then in Grim Road, there are undoubtedly going to be a lot more. Like, we already have seen one. There is an Explorer-Dinosaur relationship that is building with Marison, and the new card, the 4-cost, which I will remember the name of very, very shortly, or I will just look it up. It is called Scale Tender. that is an explorer as well. So the explorer-dinosaur relationship, watcher of the big ones, all sorts of interesting options there. We will see if this card is any good in these types of decks. It's slow, it's probably not amazing, but I think that it has some potential in like very, very specific types of explorer aggro to mid-range decks. Beyond that, you know, it's fairly low power, but that recursion effect can be useful, and the ability to play spells repeatable times and to draw spells repeatable times can be really interesting depending on what it is that you're trying to run across. Like if you're giving it echo, if you're reducing the cost of it with trail stories, if you are basically just fiddling with this card in other ways while also playing with your explorers, then that's something that could potentially get you a little bit of jump up with this card. But it does have some dead space to it. It is a fairly slow cantrip, so it's probably not full aggro. I would say that it might belong in a mid-range deck that wants to very reliably do a particular thing. We will see. There are a bunch of cards that really like just playing spells over and over again, so I can see it in a Praxis deck with cards like Fevered Scout, and with other cards that really enjoy you consistently casting spells. I'm not sure where this card belongs yet, but I'm curious to see where it ends up. Alright, I also really like the art for this card. This is just a good comedy card. Like, it has a lot of good things going on with it in the art and the design. Like, there's just, it's very flavorful in that respect, and it's kind of funny to see. Which probably leads us to our next card, Jump Kick. Alright, first time I saw this card, I thought it was a Levitate with a +1/+1, but it does not actually draw you a card. So this is a fairly weak common, but it has some interesting aspects to it, and not the least of which is that you can actually jump kick a flyer. And jump kicking a flyer, while not always the best idea, is one of the most satisfying ideas that you can have. Just basically, oh, I've got like an endurance unit, I've got some sort of unit that's just sort of standing on the ground, and my opponent's trying to fly over me, well, jump kick, now my unit is flying, and it kicks it in the face. That's a good, just straight mechanical line. And for a fairly slow common that's going to be kind of a fun card in draft in particular, I think that that's good enough. Like, you don't need this card to be powerful, but it is something that you're really going to like in draft. In draft, you can use this to push infiltrates across, which there will be some infiltrates, of course, in the set 1 archetype. You can use it to push a lot of cards with double damage, which there seem to be a larger amount of in the Grim Road. We've seen 2 cards so far with double damage already, and there's also some other ones that we are certainly going to be playing with. You can use it to push across cards like Fever Scout that really like spells. You can use it to push across cards with Lifesteal or other like really devastating effects, on-hit effects. Jump Kick does, of course, work with Yetis. It makes you your Yeti snowmen. It makes you your just all of your fun stuff there. So yeah, as far as things go, it's a pretty reasonable trick. It's a fast spell. You can pop Aegis with it. You can use it fairly offensively. Little cards like this can be very useful. It is card disadvantage, however. I think that the right type of ranked aggro deck will be running both Jump Kick and Levitate, but I don't know what that deck is. It is probably something running around with Fevered Scout or Huru Envoy and just having a delightful time kicking people in the face. Regardless, this card's pretty funny, and yeah, I like the design of it a lot. I really like the art. I think it's a hugely missed opportunity that in the art they chose to depict a Yeti kicking a giant, and they didn't choose the giant that is the giant in Jotun Punter. Like, those 2 cards should be chronologically linked. You should have Jump Kick, and then you should have Jotun Punter, and those should just be there, like, together with each other. I feel like that is just sort of, you know, a little story that you can tell. But yeah, beyond that, like, this is a really funny card. And it's fairly low power. You're not going to play it a lot in ranked. You are going to play it in draft. You're going to want this to either push across a unit and get that lethal, or maybe pop an Aegis so that you can get your removal across. It has some 2-for-1 options where you can actually use it to activate cards like Bring Down and Violent Gust. Those aren't great for you, but they are removal, and hard removal is harder to find in blue. So if you have that level of flexibility, Jump Kick is going to be a good skill testing card in draft, and you can potentially get some value out of it, especially if you have double damage cards. There is one particular target for Jump Kick that might be kind of interesting. We will see if it ends up being solid. That is Yeti Sage. Okay, so Yeti Sage is a 1/1 with double damage at 2 costs. Now, that stat line is definitely correct for a 2-cost double damage unit. You do not want this card to be too ridiculous, because double damage is a very, very powerful skill, and the more that you are increasing the strength of Yeti Sage, the more scary this card gets. Like right away, just a Rakano deck running Paladin, Oathbook, and Yeti Sage can create a 2/2 attacker off of this very, very quickly, and if you're running cards like Protect or like other options, then Yeti Sage is going to be a card that's pretty likely to stick even. So yeah, there are ways that you can just get this card out in Rakano, Finest Hour it up, and win the game very, very quickly. It kills lots of things that are bigger than it every time that it gets hit. It works well with Rapid Shot, because you can just Rapid Shot and deal 10 damage. It works well with, in draft, Jotun Punter, because you can deal 10 damage that way. Like, there are a lot of silly things going on, and I think that that's pretty cool. I really love that it has this Entomb ability that gives you a very, very minor effect, because Yeti Sage is a card that's pretty likely to get killed, and it will give you some amount of advantage in terms of like hastening the ability of your cards. Like, it will give you an extra card, but it will give you probably the least useful extra card that you can get, which is Trail Stories. I really like Trail Stories. I find that card to be really interesting and create a lot of cool opportunities with counter spells and fun tricks. Like, you can hide all sorts of stuff with it. I've played with that card a lot trying to break it. I was never able to break it, but I do think that getting a free copy of it opens up a lot of fun opportunities and also makes it so that this card is actually a lot more viable. So yeah, Yeti Sage like gets that little bit of extra power out of the Entomb, gets a little bit of extra fun out of it, and that means that you can play like a really interesting spell-focused Yeti Sage deck. And that's more support for the Curiox archetype, the Calderan Cradle archetype, for the Jump Kick archetype, if you so choose. Like, that's 4 damage, that's not too bad. Yeah, so like if you're running like Jump Kick and Rapid Shot, or Jump Kick and Rampage, and just like trying to get Yeti Sage out as fast as possible, and then follow up with cards like Praxis Outlaw, or anything that, anything in the Grim... The Dusk Road. Did I say the Grim Road? I probably said the Grim Road very early on. Alright, well, yeah, the Dusk Road that basically allows you to deal that extra amount of damage. So, yeah, that's good stuff. This card really likes combat tricks, it really likes weapons, and I think there's going to be a lot of weapon focus in this set, because we have quite a few cards that really like weapons already, including Stella and Milos, and now Yeti Sage. So, yeah. Looking interesting. He's got some cool art going on. The art's just been knocking it out of the park so far. I've been really happy with everything that they've put out. Okay, as always, we'll save the legendary for last. Here's a cool rare. We got Crownwatch Quartermaster. So this card is 6 cost, 2/4, with Valkyrie ally, play 2 2/2 soldiers. We'll cover that one first, just because that's something to consider when you're considering the stat line of this card. A 6 power 2/4 is not that good. A 6 power, basically like 6/8, that's a little bit more reasonable, especially when you're splitting those stats around into a bunch of different things that you can rally. So you pay 6 and exhaust Crownwatch Quartermaster to give another unit +1/+1 for each of your units. This is a permanent buff, so you can use this on any sort of like fairly nasty damage unit. I think that in limited, this card is particularly interesting, which is to say draft. Yeah, like this is a card that is pretty decent there, and yeah, people in my chat are also pointing that out as well. It is just a good card to play at 6 that not only has a pretty good chance of getting you 2 decent blockers, but also has a really useful exhaust ability that you can use to make all of your stuff a lot bigger and inevitably win the game. If Crownwatch Quartermaster is not removed, and removal is fairly difficult in draft, then it will just kill you. So that's pretty cool. The pay 6 cost is pretty prohibitive. You cannot play Quartermaster and then exhaust it to get a huge bonus at the same time. And if you can, you're probably running a deck that doesn't have that many units anyways. So It's unlikely to be terribly useful in like big ramp decks. It's much more beneficial for larger sort of unit-focused decks, which might make this card a little bit harder to play in ranked. But the Valkyrie ally is not usually too hard to fulfill in ranked, so getting a bunch of ground-based units and then also being able to buff up your Valkyrie for a win con, that's a lot of good things that you can ask for out of Quartermaster. And since Quartermaster cannot really be directly removed in a way that's particularly great for you, this card might see play in some Valkyrie decks, because, yeah, like, at 6, it just stabilizes your board against all of the ground-based aggro that you're trying to fly over, and then it also gives you a way to just murder your opponent with Valkyries. So that's pretty cool. I can see it being played in particular in Huru Flyers, which would have a lot of fun with it, just because it's a card that you can play down and immediately get a bunch of blockers, and also have some good stuff to just buff up your Valkyrie Enforcer. So, yeah. The Valkyrie ally is a little bit tricky to get, but I think it's fairly easy to get it just the turn that you play Quartermaster. It's unlikely that your opponent is going to be just killing your Valkyries that fast. So, yeah, I think this card sees a reasonable amount of play in ranked, not much, but it is much better in draft, and it's a very good pick for that particular list, especially if you are drafting Valkyrie, which it turns out is definitely a thing now. All right. Next up, last but not least, we have a new weapon in the same vein as the last word. This is the Name Taker. Alright, so one less than the last word. It is an 8-cost card, and it is 3 shadow. So that means that it is just a little bit cheaper, but it also has kind of an interesting stat line. It is a 6/4, which means it can kill just about anything. Mostly it kills Sandstorm Titans, which is always something that you want it to do. And it reads that when an enemy unit dies, the enemy player discards each copy from their hand and their deck. So that's a really useful ability, of course. It basically just says that if you're playing against, say, an armory deck, and you're like, I don't want to see Ikaria ever again, you just hit it with a Name Taker, and that's it for Ikaria for the rest of the game. That's kind of a decent deal. Of course, you're already getting hit with Ikaria before you play it, so that might be a bit of an issue, but there are some other things that you can do with it that are going to be pretty okay. So there are some situations where putting units into your opponent's void is going to be bad for you, but I would say that by and large, any deck where you are running Name Taker is a deck where you're going to be running Steward of the Past. So that card as a 3/5 allows you to silence all of the units as they are discarded from your opponent's deck, and it basically makes it so that you just have a much better chance of dealing with anything that might get resurrected as a result of using Name Taker to kill it. Keep in mind that Name Taker's ability does apply to anything that you are killing, so that's a pretty good deal. Someone is asking in the chat a very interesting question, which is, does Shadowlands Feaster work with this? I'm going to pull up Shadowlands Feaster real quick just to see. I think the answer may actually be yes. No, it is when an enemy unit dies, it goes to your void. So as a result, that would be something where you get the unit, but the 3 that are discarded do not go to your void. So sad days there, but by and large, it is all just not quite good enough in that respect. But okay, so Name Taker does not offer card advantage, but it does give you an interesting way to get rid of cards that you really, really need to get rid of in controlled decks. The main ones that this one's going to be really, really good against are, you can use it to kill things like Champion of Cunning, you can use it to kill things like Sandstorm Titan or Predatory Carnosaur. There are a lot of 6/6s that once you get rid of all of the copies that are in your opponent's deck, you suddenly have a much easier time dealing with the rest of their deck. Heart of the Vault, I think, is probably the biggest one. If you can hit the first Heart of the Vault and just get rid of the rest of them, the Praxis deck is pretty much in a lot of trouble. There's not going to be as much that they can do with their stuff. They basically just don't get any particularly good bonuses out of that. And once again, like, while you might want to worry a little bit about recursion, almost all of the recursion is going to be single recursion, which means that you are going to be killing something with Name Taker anyways. It's going to go to the void anyways, so it doesn't really matter if you are putting extra copies of their stuff into their deck or into their void. So yeah, like, overall, that's pretty useful. the one thing that is really nice about Nametaker is that he causes them to discard copies from their hand. So if you can actually get your opponent to basically have extra copies of a unit in their hand, in particular, Nametaker just obliterates cockroaches. Like, if you kill a cockroach with Nametaker, that's the end of the cockroach deck. That's it. That's done. So this is one of the most solid crown counters I've ever seen in terms of just making sure that that deck goes away for a little while. So something to note there is that it is quite good in that respect. I can in particular see some cool combos here with a really, really terrible film deck, and I'll describe it to you right now. Polymorph, Rain of Frogs, Nametaker. You know, I'm not actually sure if the Polymorph Frogs are the same as the Rain of Frogs. I think that they are, but that'll be something to test as soon as that card comes out. So, yeah. You do not have to kill the unit that you are looking at with Nametaker. So, like, you can just kill anything. Anything that dies, your opponent discards all copies from their hand and their deck. So if you're in, like, a big Argenport deck, you could do a thing like, say, play Nametaker, Harsh Rule, and then suddenly all of Chalice's units are gone. Like, they just don't have them anymore. Like, do they have an Amber Acolyte, a Temple Scribe, and a Borderlands Waykeeper out? Or what else is Cambrai Healer? Then suddenly they don't have those cards anymore at all. And their deck has a much lower density of low health units. So there are some interesting things that you can play around with here. Nametaker is maybe not that good of a control card. I suspect it will see play in a couple of decks that are going to really, really like it. And I think that it's just going to be fun to play. And that's been my impression so far of all of the cards that they've listed. Like, basically all of them have, like, a really interesting play pattern. They have pretty reasonable amounts of power associated with them, but they're not, we haven't seen any, like, crazy broken cards yet. And that's okay. Like, these are all cards that I'm just really going to want to play, and some of them are going to be good in very specific decks, which is also what you want to see. You want to see new decks being built out, and I think that there's going to be a pretty big impact on the meta from all of the cards that have been released. I would say that these cards look like they're going to be a little bit higher power level than some of the cards in Omens of the past. Like, overall, most of the cards that we've seen have actually had, like, a really reasonable amount of play lines from what we saw in Omens. So, yeah, looks pretty cool, and I love this card. There have been some really funny cards, and that's really nice. Oh, one last thing about the Nametaker. I am almost 100% certain. Let's actually check that real quick. I've been doing a lot of this, but okay, so if we hide the spoiler here and go into our thing, I believe that the Nametaker is, in fact, Ashara the Deadshot's pistol. Yep, that's the Nametaker right there. So, yeah. One last little bit of lore there. Ashara the Deadshot carries the Nametaker. I don't know who carries the last word, but that's it for me. So, to the YouTube folks, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. And to the Twitch folks, we're going to go back to playing some games. So, yeah. See you guys soon.